You're not in danger, not in motion, just in that quiet period before anything begins. The environment is controlled, the air is still. Your senses soften as if you're resting in a secure military zone with engines humming far below. Tonight's tale unfolds with slow precision, guiding your thoughts gently downward. Everything feels distant now, like a base settling into its night cycle. The story ahead drifts in at that same slow rhythm. Let's step into it. The carrier was already dying before the thing ever touched its hull. We had been out on the frontier for 11 months, trading hull plates and blood for anonymous coordinates in sectors that barely had names. The armor was scarred from debris swarms and glancing strikes. Interior panels creaked with every minor course correction. I could tell by the vibration under my boots when the main drives were being overtaxed again. I knew the pitch like I knew my own pulse. When the signal came in, I was in the suit bay, recalibrating a misaligned knee actuator. The deck shuddered once, then settled into that near silence that meant navigation had cut to minimum thrust. The sudden absence of engine noise on a long patrol feels wrong, like a heart skipping beats. We drifted in a dead system, orbiting a gas giant wrapped in bands of weak, colorless storms. Out beyond the carrier's shadow was the refueling lattice, a thin, skeletal frame of trusses and tanks, rendered in our helmet overlays as a ghostly wireframe. The lattice had been marked abandoned 2 campaigns ago. It should not have been transmitting anything. Protocol did not care that the crew was exhausted or that the hull needed a real dock instead of patch plates. A repeating pattern of energy on a registered structure meant investigation, and investigation meant us. My name is Cade Mercer, Staff Sergeant, Breach Lead. When command needs to walk something dangerous in through a bulkhead, they send me and whoever is still alive in my squad. We crossed the gap in a staggered line, suits on full seal, boots gripping with each slow step along the carrier's external spine. Behind us, the ship's hull disappeared into darkness. Ahead, the lattice floated like a rusted cage, orientation meaningless in the void. My visor painted distance and relative vector. My balance relied entirely on that. Entering an abandoned structure is always the most careful moment. You never know who claimed it after it was written off on some logistics slate. Pirates, stragglers, enemy saboteurs, or nothing at all. Nothing is sometimes worse because empty places collect strange things. We maglocked to one of the lattice's terminal rings and burned a hatch open with a cutter. The metal peeled under the bright wash of the torch, edges glowing, vapor freezing as it boiled away. My suit's filters compensated for the plume of particulates that followed us inside. No lights. No heat signatures. The interior atmosphere was thin and cold. Our own suit beams cut cones through motes of frozen dust. Bodies drifted in the corridors, anchored to handholds by straps or wedged in corners where they had died. They were in various stages of freeze-dried collapse, limbs locked in the positions they'd been in when the air left. Whoever had held the lattice had fought for it. We saw welded hatch frames, scorched bulkheads, spent casings still floating in slow clusters. Someone had tried to lock this place down from the inside. It had not worked. We moved in practiced formation, leapfrogging past junctions, checking blind angles. The air was so cold it might as well have been vacuum. My suit's joints complained as the ambient temperature pulled heat out of them. The familiar ache in my ribs started when the torso brace tightened to compensate. The signal source was central, deeper in. The navigation overlay pointed us toward the lattice's fuel management ring, a wider hub where pump controls, storage monitors, and emergency shutoffs were clustered. It should have been a clean, open space. Instead, we found improvised barricades made from cargo containers, broken consoles, and slabs of plating. There were more bodies here, Some had died at the barricades, rifles locked in frozen grips, armor charred. Others lay half out of their suits, as if they had been trying to get away from their own skins when the end came. We pushed inward, climbing over the dead and the wreckage, boots scraping frost from surfaces. At the center of the ring, occupying what had once been a circular control plinth, was what they had tried to hold. It had grown out of the decking and the underlying supports, a dense knot of semi-organic material fused with metal. It looked like someone had poured molten bone and wire together, then let it cool into a tangle that reached floor to ceiling. The skin of it was pale and ridged, threaded with darker veins that might have been cabling or vessels. Where it met the surrounding structure, the distinction between alien and station vanished. It was all the same mass, grown into the steel-like roots through soil. My helmet marked faint residual power pulses inside the thing. Nothing regular, just occasional spikes, like an exhausted heart refusing to stop. Our orders were clear. Document, detach if possible, and bring back anything that could be analyzed. The frontier war has long since moved past clean lines and identifiable weapons. Anything the enemy uses that we do not understand gets studied. Sometimes it kills us before it informs us. That is part of the job. We circled the mass, mapping it, tracing its anchoring points. The last garrison had erected skeletal containment frames around it, the remnants of a field cage that had failed. Scorch marks on the bulkheads and the collapsed bodies suggested the failure had been violent. We set cutters along the main growth cords, clamped them in place, told them to work slowly. The heat made the air near the mass shimmer, even in that near vacuum, ice sublimating into thin fog. At first, it did nothing. Then the pulses inside it synchronized. My helmet displayed a sharp, sudden surge of internal energy. The veins along its surface darkened, then brightened with something like circulation. A low vibration came through my boots, through the deck. The mass flexed. It was a subtle shift, but in zero-G, any movement feels amplified. Filaments extruded from ridges I had assumed were solid, whipping outward at high speed, too fast for the suit cameras to track in detail. They snapped against armor, plating, visors, the inside of the containment frame. Most of them glanced off. One found a gap. Corporal Varan was slightly behind and to my right. A narrow space existed between his backplate and shoulder assembly where the reinforcement ring met the composite. It was designed to allow rotational movement under load. The filament struck that precise seam. The alert on my overlay registered a moment later. Micro breach, localized sealant deployment. We carried sealant packs for a reason. His suit compensated automatically, foam filling the microscopic tear, pressure equalizing. From the outside, it looked like a minor anomaly on my HUD, another small failure among many. We cut power to the tools and backed off. The mass retracted its filaments, surface settling back into stillness. The pulses remained, lower amplitude but regular now. It had felt us. That was my first thought. Command wanted it moved. We were an hour overdue on the lattice as it was, any longer, and the carrier's orbit would drift. On the frontier, nothing is permitted to drift. We used winches and anchored clamps to tear the thing free. It came away with a sound transmitted through suit contact, a damp, grinding rip that had nothing to do with metal. Underneath, the deck was shredded and discolored as if the material had been leached, then replaced. We floated the mass back toward the hatch, guiding it between us like pallbearers. Varan complained once over the squad net about a numbness between his shoulders, then went quiet. The biomonitors insisted he was stable. I filed it under strain and moved on. Back on the carrier, the mass was moved into a hardened containment bay near the core research compartment. Varan was routed to medical for scans and decontamination. The lattice receded behind us as the carrier corrected its orbit and burned for the next relay point. From there, the war shifted inside. The first indications were small. Cameras in the specimen bay returned intermittent static. The local environmental system reported minor, unexplained fluctuations in pressure that corrected themselves. A maintenance drone assigned to the corridor outside failed to check in and was logged as lost probable collision. No one pays much attention to single, isolated faults on a ship of that age. There is always something failing. I began to notice a pattern when two of my Marines failed to report back from an inspection of the forward ballast passageways. They had been sent to visually verify a series of minor hull stresses flagged by the structural grid. It should have been a routine walk in suits, a chance to stretch and complain in private channels. Their locator beacons reached the assigned exit point and stayed there. No movement, no signal. I took a smaller team and pushed out to meet them, cutting through a series of low-clearance shafts where the recycled air smelled of metal dust and coolant. The lighting strips overhead flickered between full brightness and a dim, pulsing glow more suited to an infirmary than a battlefield. My boots stuck and unstuck from the mesh decking in a familiar rhythm. We found the first Marine half-wedged into an access crawl. His suit was intact. Armor unmarred, no blast marks, no puncture scoring. His posture was wrong, folded in on itself in a way that suggested he had tried to crawl deeper into the shaft and then simply stopped. Inside the helmet, his face was black with ruptured vessels, eyes open, fixed, no obvious impact trauma. It looked like he had been pressurized past what his tissues could handle and then left to freeze. The second Marine was further in a cross-junction where several power and data conduits met. He had slipped free of the floor mesh and was floating, arms out. Tether had snapped or been cut. His torso showed bulges under the plates, odd swelling where the suit should have held a standard profile. Frost had grown in a complex, branching pattern over his visor, as if something inside had exhaled moisture in regular, synchronized bursts. His biomonitor was dark. His suit telemetry was steadily broadcasting a generic hardware error. We did not open them there. We tagged their suits for retrieval, recorded everything from multiple angles, and backed out. On the way, my motion sensor picked up irregular readings inside the walls. At first, I thought it was residual vibration from the engines. Then I realized the engines were operating at low thrust, and the patterns did not match any known frequency. They were more like crawling. We reported to command. The carrier's internal map updated with red shading along that maintenance run, a soft quarantine line. Medical informed us that Varan was in isolation. His scans had shown foreign structures in his spinal column, delicate branching filaments that had not been there before. They had tried to excise one. It had vanished between imaging sweeps. By the next watch, 3 more compartments were sealed. The organism was never obvious in the beginning. It did not emerge as a recognizable creature that could be shot and dragged away. It seeped into corners, into ducting, into wiring. It took over small surfaces first, a patch of wall insulation with a new fibrous texture, droplets of condensate that refused to evaporate, a faint organic smell in what should have been sterile machinery spaces. The first time we saw a clear, fully developed growth, it filled a junction room on deck 6. We accessed the deck via a vertical trunk. When the hatch split open, the space beyond looked like it had grown a second skin. The walls were coated in layered tissue that was neither flesh nor plastic, ridged and veined like the mass we had taken from the lattice. Layers of translucent film hung from the ceiling, trembling minutely in the recycled breeze. The floor was obscured by a web of tendrils that had encased equipment, consoles, and 3 members of the engineering crew. They were upright, partially embedded. Their torsos had been opened from within, not by force, but by pressure. Thin, flexible cords ran from their spinal columns and rib cages into the surrounding material. Their faces were slack, features distorted by the pull of connective strands. We burned that room. Rail rounds tore channels through the growth, superheating and igniting it. Fire suppressants fought us at first, then died as the organism hijacked the local system, valves locking shut. The tissue did not burn clean. It shrank and charred, exuding smoke thick with particles that clung to our armor. It took several minutes to reduce it to a shriveled, blackened mass that still twitched at the edges. When we withdrew, my motion sensor showed the same crawling patterns along adjacent bulkheads, receding from our presence. It was adapting, testing the carrier like a new body and learning where the nerves lay. Command tried to box it in. Bulkheads closed. Ventilation routes were reconfigured. Entire decks were cut off from the main corridor grid. The ship's internal view on the tactical display shrank as more areas were marked in red and labeled compromised. Comms traffic thickened, then thinned, then fractured into isolated local nets as the organism interfered with data lines. At some point, we stopped seeing the carrier as a whole and started seeing it as a collection of besieged compartments. My squad was assigned to the central axes, the reactor access ways, the primary life support trunks, the routes that connected the beating heart of the ship to its limbs. We established checkpoints, cleared them again. Every hour, the walls seemed a little different. Panels did not quite sit the way they used to. Bolts had a fine, powdery residue that had not been there before. We stopped touching anything without gloves, as if that would make a difference. The organism began to test us directly. We lost a Marine in the aft coolant gallery. The space was narrow, pipes and conduits crowding the ceiling and floor, filled with the constant hiss and low rumble of fluid movement. Our objective was to confirm that the coolant lines had not been compromised. If the organism reached the loops feeding the reactor, it could go anywhere it wanted inside the carrier's infrastructure. The Marine was at point, sweeping his sensor in tight arcs. We followed at regular intervals, visibility only a few meters in the dense framework of piping. There was no warning. One moment his marker was ahead of us, moving. The next, it was stationary, then gone. I reached his last known position and saw only a slight discoloration on the wall insulation, like a watermark spreading outward. It was still shifting, edges creeping around the bolt heads. His locator beacon was embedded somewhere inside that thickening patch. It did not matter. We backed away and called for an atmosphere purge of the section. The purge command failed. Instead, the local environment briefly cycled into high humidity, then normalized. The organism was learning to intercept commands. It had touched more than just isolated hardware now. It had reached decision pathways. In a conventional boarding action, you can always fall back on brute force. Blow a hatch, reroute through another corridor, vent a compartment, cut a path with charges. Inside the carrier, with this thing in the walls, every application of force risked giving it more material to rearrange. Soon after, we began to see articulated forms. They were not soldiers. They were extensions. On Deck 3, in a junction where 3 major corridors met, we encountered what passed for a forward probe. It had grown from the ceiling, a conglomeration of cords and plates that had harvested armor scrap, panel fragments, and tool casings. It hung there, suspended, limbs braced against the walls, a crude approximation of purposeful movement. Where a head might have been, a cluster of sensor-like bulbs throbbed, each containing a dark, rotating core. When we stepped into its field of view, they brightened in unison. The thing adjusted its stance, as much a shift in distribution of tension as anything else. We shot it. Rail rounds punched through the improvised armor and the underlying tissue. It convulsed, cords tightening, then sagged, fluids boiling off in the thin air, coating the floor in a thin, slick film. But while we brought it down, the walls around it swelled and flexed, as if taking note of impact, vectors, ammunition type, firing arcs. The next time we saw one, its weak points were better shielded. By then, half the carrier was lost. Map overlays turned from red to black as sections went silent entirely. We heard distant detonations as damage control teams tried to carve fire breaks with explosives. Sometimes we felt the tremors where we stood, a low, sustained vibration of metal protesting at forced amputation. Command convened what was left of leadership in a hardened briefing cell near the reactor shaft. The air in there was relatively clean. The lights worked. The walls were still mostly just walls. The plan they laid out was short. We could not fully eradicate the organism without dismantling the entire ship. We did not have the power reserves, time, or manpower left to do that. We could, however, deny it the critical systems that would let it propagate beyond the hull. That meant the reactor, the drive assemblies, and the main communication arrays. We would isolate the reactor loop mechanically, then set up shaped charges along the reactor's coupling to the drive core. If the organism began to overrun the last secure perimeter, we would overload control rods, let the core burn hotter than spec, and trigger localized structural failure that would tear the central spine apart. The carrier would be crippled and mostly destroyed. The organism would be reduced to drifting debris in a dead system. There was little discussion. No one offered alternatives. Alternatives belonged to ships that were still fully alive. We deployed along the central shaft. The reactor was a vast armored mass humming with constrained power, surrounded by walkways, control stations, and maintenance platforms. It occupied several decks in height. The organism had not yet reached it in force, though thin tendrils had begun to grow along some of the cable trunks, faintly pulsing. We moved fast, planting charges where structure was thickest and failure would be most decisive. We welded manual lockouts onto control interfaces so nothing could reverse the overload sequence without cutting through hardened steel. Every action felt both measured and rushed, the way final preparations always do. The attack came in layers. First, environmental systems along the shaft flickered and failed, leaving us in emergency lighting. Thin, reddish illumination washed everything in the color of dried blood. Then gravity faltered, cut out entirely, returned at half strength, tilted sideways as inertial systems fought interference. We anchored without boots and suit clamps, but the disorientation slowed us. Next, the organism pushed through several bulkheads at once. Panels along the shaft's perimeter bulged, then burst outward as dense growths exploded into the space. Tendrils lashed out, some as thick as a man's arm, others as fine as hair, but strong enough to snag and reel in anything they touched. They came from all directions, having used the shaft's own conduits as pathways. Marines were lifted off the deck, thrown against railings, dragged toward widening holes where the growth was densest. Armor held for a time, then crumpled where the organism discovered weak points. Those it could not immediately breach, it simply bound, wrapping in layers of fibrous tissue until movement ceased. We fired in controlled bursts, rail rounds chewing through tendrils, severing growths, tearing wounds that immediately began to clot with fresh material. Heat blossomed in our visors, targeting overlays filled with moving tags and warnings. There were no clear fronts, only pockets of contested space around each Marine. I remember seeing Lieutenant Harrow on a platform above me, half his body already encased. His free arm was still reaching for a manual override lever. Their faces always looked the same in those final seconds, focused, not on dying, but on finishing the task. We could not pull him free without losing more people. I set a charge on the support strut near his position and moved on. In a war like that, mercy and denial become the same motion. We fell back from the upper platforms, consolidating at the lowest level around the reactor's physical interfaces. The organism pressed in, sending thinner, faster tendrils ahead of its main mass, testing defenses, searching gaps. It had learned from every engagement before this. It knew our weapons, our armor, our patterns of retreat. We triggered the overload sequence. Reactors are built not to do what we forced this one to. We bypass safeguards in layers, physical and digital, cutting power where systems tried to resist us. Control rods began to withdraw beyond safety margins. Coolant flow throttled in ways it was never meant to. The hum under our boots turned into a deep, rising vibration that resonated in bone. Heat bled into the shaft. The air thickened. My suit's internal temperature warning spiked, then maxed out. The organism reacted instantly. It surged toward the reactor's interfaces, abandoning extended positions along the shaft to mass, where its new environment was being threatened. It tried to sheath the interfaces in thick, insulating layers, growing over panels, ports, and seams. We held the perimeter as long as we could. Marines disappeared into advancing walls of tissue, swallowed whole. Some detonated their suits' emergency charges when pinned, taking chunks of the organism with them. It never screamed. It only recoiled, regrouped, and pushed again. When the core crossed a threshold no engineer would have willingly approached, I gave the final command. The charges we had placed along the central spine detonated in sequence. The world turned to motion and noise. The shaft twisted as shaped blasts tore structural rings apart. Sections of the reactor housing wrenched loose, shearing away from the rest of the ship. Gravity ceased to have any meaning. We were flung against whatever surface happened to be nearest. Then, abruptly, there was silence. My visor rebooted twice before stabilizing. My suit's diagnostics were a wall of orange and red. I was pinned in a maintenance gallery that had once run along the reactor's outer shell. Now, it opened onto open space, the reactor gone, the gallery's end torn away. Stars filled the gap, an uneven frame of jagged metal around them. Chunks of the carrier drifted in slow procession outside. Some glowed faintly where residual heat escaped. Others were dark, just shapes against the sparse background stars of a dead system. No main drive plume, no organized movement. The carrier was a broken carcass. Inside my compartment, the air was thin but present. The integrity field barely holding across a web of emergency projectors. I could feel the raw vacuum only meters away. The gallery's surfaces were scorched, but mostly free of the organism's growths. It had been burned away here by heat and the violence of the detonation. I did not know then if anyone else had survived. Suitcom cycled through channels, catching fragments of static, occasional bursts that might have been voices or just interference. The ship-wide net was gone. Local beacons from other compartments were either too distant or too shielded by debris to reach me. In the end, I shut the receiver down to conserve power. Silence was better than listening to ghosts. I anchored myself against a support brace and took inventory. Oxygen reserves were low but not critical. Suit power was sufficient to maintain life support for some hours, perhaps longer if I rationed heat. Ammunition was largely irrelevant now. There was nowhere to advance to and nothing left to hold. What I did have was a functioning recorder. Every operation produces data, sensor logs, helmet feeds, biomonitor streams, field notes. In normal circumstances, those flows are consolidated and reviewed by analysts in secure facilities far from the front. On the carrier, in that torn gallery, I had only my own perspective and whatever pieces I could remember. So I began to speak into the void, not for comfort, but for record. I walked through the sequence of events as I understood them. The diversion to the lattice, the discovery of the mass, the breach in Varan's armor, the early anomalies, the first dead Marines in the maintenance shafts, the rooms overrun with growth, the improvised forms that hung from ceilings like crude, evolving mannequins, the tightening ring around the reactor. I spoke about the choices made, the ones I had made and the ones above me. I did not editorialize. An after-action report does not care for feelings, it cares for cause and effect. Time stretched. The gallery cooled. My breath condensed inside the helmet, forming faint clouds that dissipated with each cycle. Occasionally, a piece of the carrier drifted close enough to cast a shadow across my compartment, a reminder that I was not alone in the debris field, even if no other living mind remained. At some point, my thoughts circled back to the lattice. There had been writing on one of the bulkheads near the barricades, scratched into the metal with something sharp. I had brushed frost away with my glove to read it. The letters had been jagged, rushed, barely legible. Whoever carved them had done so in the last minutes before they sealed that central chamber for the final time. I remember the motion more than the words, the way metal curls when you score it with force, the resistance through the glove, the sound transmitted through touch instead of air. We had recorded the text in our suit feeds, filed it with the rest as we moved on. That warning was never meant for us. It had been meant for whoever followed them closely enough to still matter. We had arrived too late for that. We had not been too late to repeat their mistake. My hand curled unconsciously around the brace now, feeling the cold bite of the metal through the suit's insulation. I imagined their hands, the ones who had written those last marks, feeling the same texture, panic behind them, something pushing at the other side of the barricade, protocol demanding that information be preserved even then. We had followed protocol. That is what we do. Out beyond the ragged edge of my gallery, a small object drifted into view, tumbling slowly. It was a casing from one of our charges, blackened, half melted. As it turned, I saw a thin film clinging to its surface, translucent and faintly ridged. I raised my weapon out of habit, then lowered it again. The casing spun away, caught in an invisible current of momentum. I do not know if every filament of the organism died when the reactor tore free. We burned it, blew it apart, scattered it into an empty system where no one should ever come. That may be enough. It may not. That decision is no longer mine. It belongs to whatever recovery team, if any, chooses to approach a broken carrier broadcasting no codes at the edge of a map. My task was to hold the lines long enough to trigger the denial sequence. I did that. My task now is simply to ensure that the path from first contact to final detonation is recorded in one continuous line, free of gaps, so someone else can decide what it means. I do not expect rescue. I do not expect judgment. I expect only that eventually my suit power will fail, and with it, this gallery's field. The vacuum outside will finally equalize the pressure difference, and there will be no more vibration under my boots to tell me whether the ship is alive or dead. Until then, I remember. I remember the feel of that first hatch on the lattice yielding under the cutter, the sound in my bones when the mass flexed, the way Varan's biomonitor flashed and then normalized as if nothing of significance had happened, the texture of the scratched warning under my glove. Those are the images that remain when you strip away tactics and procedure. Metal, cold, pressure, a hand moving across a surface, leaving marks for someone else to ignore. This is my mark. The end. The narrative settles, and the world returns to a fortified, peaceful quiet. You're in the safest part of the night now. Let sleep take over.